incredibly excited for this conversation. I really wanted to foster interdisciplinary collaboration, so we have the honor of welcoming people from computer science, linguistics, philosophy, psychology, to really talk about the crossovers and the links that these all have in our understanding of the mind. So how about we start with a quick round of introduction in the order of the pictures. So Dr. Gold, you can start.
Yes, so I'm Ian Gold. I'm a professor of philosophy and psychiatry here. What more do you want to say? I work in some theoretical things, and I also have a small lab where we work on some social cognition topics and on some topics around psychosis.
Oh, I'm Stevan Harnad. I'm at University, UQAM and McGill and University of Southampton. And my original formation was as a psychologist. I did an honors psych here at McGill yonks ago. And now I'm here again.
Hello everyone, my name is Karim Jerbi. I'm a professor at the University of Montreal in the psychology department. I'm another psychologist. My expertise is in neuroscience and AI, the interface between the two. And I currently head the UNIQUE Center, and it's a research center that brings together researchers from artificial intelligence and researchers from neuroscience to get to work together by co-supervising students at the interface, at the intersection between the two fields. I'm in neuroscience now because I think as a 9-year-old, my dream was to build a machine that could allow us in real time to watch dreams while people are dreaming. I haven't quite managed to do that yet, but it's still on the plan. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. It's wonderful to see everybody here, and specifically this crowd of undergraduate students in cognitive science. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussions that we'll have now and also afterwards.
Hi everyone, my name is Doina Precup. I'm in the School of Computer Science here at McGill. I'm a computer scientist by training. I work in a field called reinforcement learning, which is about learning from interaction with an environment, and it's really a very interdisciplinary research field. I look mainly at computational methods, but I have colleagues who look at this from the point of view of neuroscience, cognitive science, animal behavior learning, economics, and I really find it very impressive that you guys are all here to listen to us, so thank you for coming, and looking forward to the discussion.
I'm Charles Reiss. I'm at Concordia in the linguistics program, which is actually in the Department of Classics, Modern Languages and Linguistics, so a big humanities department. I have a background in a bachelor's degree in math, but liberal arts degree, and then a PhD in linguistics. And I'm a phonologist, so I work on abstract patterns in language. Basically simple mathematical patterns in language.
Amazing. So you've seen me running around all day already, but to be the chair of CogSURF. But my role today is really just to facilitate the conversation. I'll be having the honor of moderating this discussion. I have a set of pre-prepared questions, but we'll have time for audience Q&A in the end, and the role is really for the panelists to build on each other's points and just to have more of a natural conversation. So I'm really, really excited. This was my dream panel. I think I was super excited that you all accepted to come here, so really grateful. So, and the goal really of this discussion is to inspire emerging researchers. So I'd like to start with my first question, which is that cognitive science is an unusual field because it doesn't have a single predefined career path, and many of you come from different academic backgrounds before converging on cognitive science. So could you describe the moment or experience that sparked your interest in this field?
So I actually before I start, I'll just say, I just want to echo what Doina said. This is an amazing event, and I'm in awe of the organizers and all of you, so thank you for coming. I'll take the opportunity, since the story actually involves this person. I had a supervisor here when I was an undergraduate called Jim McGill. Sadly, he just passed away. But he was interested in perception, which is one of the things that philosophers work on. So philosophers are interested in a field that we call epistemology, which is the field of the study of how you know things. And of course, there's a very long tradition, the tradition that founded psychology, that says if you want to know something, you have to begin by perceiving the world. And Jim worked on color perception, which is a rather specialized thing, really fascinating topic. And he made me understand that by thinking about color perception, you could think about very big issues, about what the world is like and how we know about it. But what was unusual about him was that, unlike most philosophers of the period, Jim thought that in order to answer the philosophical questions, you had to know something about what scientists were doing. This was a period where what's called opponent process theory of color, very influential theory of color, computational models were just coming in. I mean, Professor Kenwisher mentioned David Marr. I mean, I'm old enough when David Marr was a new thing. Everyone was very excited about David Marr. And so Jim influenced me to think a little bit about the way in which science could address philosophical questions. And that's how I got interested in CogSURF.
Is it?
I know exactly when and where it happened. It's very near to where we are now. I was in Site 21. It was still being given in the Precup building. Precup building, with multiple sessions. And it was given by Donald Olding Head. And I went into it for the same reason most undergraduates go into psychology. They want to know about the mind and other people's minds and help people with their minds, etc., etc. All very noble goals. But it seems very remote to me now. He weaned us away from that, and those days, now the only place where there's still Freudian psychoanalytic stuff is at University, is at UCAP. But those are in the past for psychology everywhere else. But Heb, in trying to sort of seduce us away from these usual undergraduate reasons for taking psychology, started to talk about his research on monkeys at Yerke's lab and on learning in general in organisms. That he said, I think that where psychology should go is into the brain. He said during that course, Psych 21, he said, I think the greatest psychologist, this was in the 60s, I think the greatest living psychologist is B.F. Skinner. But I'm pretty sure he didn't mean it. Like, that was just sort of modesty by him. In fact, he was probably the greatest psychologist at the time. He had a huge influence. Where we do have a little bit of Skinner left over in reinforcement, but only as sort of a superficial remnant, because he didn't have any explanation of reinforcement. He just said, yes, you can get an animal to do whatever you want it to do by reinforcing it, or not reinforcing it. Heb, on the other hand, has Hebbian learning and Hebbian networks still today, and these are at the forefront of everything right now. So it was seeded then, and here I am now.
So I'm not quite sure, but I think, so on top of the me wanting to create this machine that can visualize dreams in real time, I've been obsessed by the trying to understand consciousness as a young kid, I think. And I had this experience of like once realizing at some point what we now refer to as the philosophical zombie, realizing that I have only access to my own subjective experience, and that technically all those around me, I have the intuition that they are conscious, but I have absolutely no proof. And when that idea hit me, maybe I was like, I don't know, 10 or 11 or something, I was like stuck, like, okay, well, I will never be able to know whether others around me have consciousness. And so my only approach that I found plausible to try to at least pretend that I'm doing something to address the question that I'll never answer is probably going towards the brain. That was my intuition. I don't know if that was a good idea or not, but I realized afterwards that I really am interested in the brain. I did my baccalaureate. This is when I was 18 in Tunisia. That's where I did that's where I lived all my life until the age of 18. And then after that, I wanted to study the brain, and there was an opportunity to get a scholarship to go abroad, study elsewhere. And I said, well, I'll do the brain. They told me, well, if you want to do the brain, you should do neurology, and you should do that at the Faculty of Medicine in Tunis. Or you can get a scholarship because you got good grades and you can go study engineering in Germany. And I was like, I'm going to go study engineering in Germany. And I said, we'll see about the brain later. And I was lucky enough to find a way to do biomedical engineering and that was my undergrad. I went to engineering, and then I made my way back to to neuroimaging and cognitive neuroscience PhD towards the neurosciences. And today I'm happy that I went that route because I ended up doing a lot of signal processing, machine learning applied to brain data, and then going back and forth between the brain and AI. So I think that was a lucky choice that I made, maybe not so consciously at the time. But yeah, I think that was sort of the beginning of everything.
So my career choices were somewhat informed by sort of my background. I grew up in Romania. It was a communist country, and the current historical context gives me a little bit the jibby-jibbies thinking back to those days. But we'll leave that aside. I wanted to do something to get out, and so I did what I was best at, which was computer science for my undergrad. But I was very interested in intelligence. I was interested in robots and sci-fi and all these kinds of things. I read Asimov and a lot of other similar stuff. I was lucky enough to go to do my PhD in the States. I got a fellowship to do that. And that's when I discovered actually reinforcement learning. Before that, it was all supervised learning from labeled data. And that didn't seem very natural. I was interested in how people learn by interacting with their environment. So reinforcement learning really fit my mental model of what intelligence and learning ought to be. And so that's why I kind of stuck in this research area. But my PhD was with Rich Sutton, who's one of the co-founders of computational reinforcement learning. The other co-director of the lab was Andy Bartow. So they were very much steeped in this tradition of being an intersection field especially between neuroscience, sort of computational science, and control theory and sort of engineering. And so it gave me a completely different perspective of, yes, we're building computational algorithms, they're going to do something interesting and useful, but also there's these connections with learning in the brain, with learning in a naturalistic environment, and so that sort of, the field drew me in a way because of this setup of not just being useful for something, but actually showing some aspects of real intelligence, of human and animal intelligence. And I find that we're in an interesting moment in time now also in AI because of, the rise of large models, the rise of, ways of training these machines that are actually quite unlike what we do. So I still feel kind of rooted in that tradition of more like learning from interaction, and I'd like to push that further.
Okay, so you guys are pretty lucky because you can leave here with a piece of paper that says you're a cognitive scientist. But when I got interested in cognitive science, I realized that becoming a cognitive science is an example of what we call a performative speech act. Basically, I said, I'm a cognitive scientist, and then I got to say it. There were no departments. Almost nobody knew what it meant. So it's kind of like, I now pronounce you husband and wife, or I christen this ship the Queen Elizabeth, right? If you say it, it becomes true by virtue of saying it. So I was doing linguistics. I started out doing historical linguistics, dead languages and the like, and then I finally got interested in theoretical linguistics, but Chomsky would say things like, linguistics is part of psychology and ultimately part of biology, and I had no idea what he was talking about, even though I was finishing up a PhD in linguistics. I just was completely clueless. And one summer I followed up on an invitation to go into a phonetics lab in northern Sweden to learn how to analyze sound on sun stations, all kinds of fancy computers. But when I got there was nobody there to teach me anything, so I went to the library and I read Zenon Polishin's from Montreal, actually, but I read his book, his 1984 book, Computation and Cognition, and that's when I realized that's what I want to do. I want to be a cognitive scientist. So it was just that summer bored in a phonetics lab that made me figure out what I really was interested in.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was fascinating. I feel like you all come from such different backgrounds, but there's also a lot of roots from McGill and Montreal, so that's really exciting to see. Maybe some of us in this room will be on a panel in the future talking about our journey in cognitive science. But yeah, thank you so much again. And I think you touch on the topic of consciousness, and I think that's something that's of interest to a lot of people. And in our first meeting, we talked about LLMs and understanding. So perhaps you could talk about how consciousness remains a central mystery, but how do your respective disciplines approach these questions, especially in light of the new AI algorithms, for example, and the new insights that have emerged at the crossroads of multiple disciplines.
Do you want me to start?
Oh, anyone can start.
Okay. I'm hoping somebody else might start.
I can make your wishes come true.
Please.
Oh, I shouldn't have. If there are any of my students in the audience, they know that I'm going to use a W word in a moment. I consider consciousness to be a weasel word. It is not, it doesn't really mean anything, or it means everything and the opposite of everything. That's why I only talk about sentience, which is the only relevant part of consciousness. You might say, isn't sentience another weasel word? No, sentience is feeling, not just touchy-feeling, emotional feeling, but also what it feels like to see red, what it feels like to know how to ride a bike, and what it feels like to understand when somebody's speaking to you. So even the LLM understanding session was at root related to the question of sentience rather than consciousness. I don't know whether that de-weaseling takes it into another area, or is that still what you're interested in? Feeling.
I feel targeted here. No, is the question whether I think sentience is is a better replacement to the. We had a couple of years ago. We invited Michael Graziano to the main Montreal AI and Neuroscience meeting, which, by the way, we hold every year, and I encourage everybody here to follow us. This happens generally in November, December, and it's an international meeting that happens in Montreal, organized by the Unique Center. His proposal at that meeting was to give the term consciousness a break for at least a year, and not use it and forbid the use of the word consciousness. So you're familiar with his work on attention schema and other approaches to exploring phenomena and mechanisms related to consciousness, or to what we generally refer to as consciousness. And I think that's a good point, and I would also agree that sentience is probably something that we will have less of the, in all the discussions about consciousness, and in particular also the discussions about, let's say, quote-unquote machine consciousness. At some point, 15 minutes through the discussion, somebody's going to say, but wait, define consciousness. And so we go back to square one in all of these discussions, and it's always the same thing. I think sentience might allow us to have less of that. But I don't know that it's like it covers all the aspects that everybody sees under the umbrella of consciousness. There might be other things, and probably my colleagues here are more informed than I am. But I do think that it's more concrete. Whether it covers everything that people relate to when they talk about consciousness, I don't know, but it's more concrete.
So I'll jump in to pick up on something Karim just said. So the reason I was hoping somebody else would start is because my view about consciousness is a bit of a downer, which is that we don't have a clue what to say about it. The upside of it is that consciousness is the place where the work of the philosopher still remains to be done. That's the place where it's most clear that philosophy is part of cognitive science, because the problem of consciousness is not an empirical problem. I mean, it will be a series of empirical problems. It already is a series of empirical problems, but it's still at that stage where we don't really understand what it is we're talking about. And there's clearly something unique from the point of view of science of a problem where access to the phenomena of interest comes about in this different way, namely looking inside your own mind. So there are some conceptual problems that we have to sort out, and at the moment we don't have a clue how to do it. The most interesting work from the point of view of philosophers on consciousness, the work of David Chalmers, is actually an even bigger downer, because according to Chalmers, the problem is not a scientific problem. And so we really need some conceptual work to turn this problem into an empirical problem, assuming it can be turned into an empirical problem. And once we can do that, then you can get rid of the philosophers and you can have the scientists do the real work.
If I can follow up, this is a question to you, Ian. I'm just curious because, so we in interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary conversations, and in particular around consciousness or sentience, we more and more we hear the argument that this needs expertise from different fields, from biology, psychology, neuroscience, AI, philosophy, to tackle this issue together. And then the huge problem there is understanding one another so that these disciplines can actually even talk this, more or less, that they know what they're talking about when they use specific terms. So I was just curious of your experience in the interactions, say, for example, with either computer scientists or neuroscientists on topics such as consciousness or even other topics in philosophy. How's that experience been? Because sometimes it feels like everybody says, yes, we need to have all disciplines. But has that really led to substantial improvement or a better understanding in one field or the other or in all fields? Has that, how is that working?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've been very, very lucky. I found scientists working on things that I'm interested in to be not only willing to talk to me, but interested in talking to me. McGill has been remarkable, is remarkable in this way. I didn't expect anyone in medicine to have any interest in my ideas, and that hasn't been the case. There's no question that figuring out how other people are using the terms that they're interested in, what sentience means as opposed to consciousness, that's the work that you have to do, you know, as an appetizer, and then we get to the main course, and that's when things get interesting. I don't know that things have got conceptually better, but I think I've seen people make use of, I've seen philosophers make use of science to advance their own thinking. I mean, again, this morning, Professor Canwisher's talk, right? The question: can congenitally blind people recognize faces? You know, this is a very famous problem. If you go and read John Locke, the founder of psychology, many centuries ago, Locke has a section where he talks about the Molyneux problem. Molyneux was a man who wrote to him and said, "Tell me, Mr. Locke, could somebody, on your view, who was born blind, recognize something if they suddenly regain their sight?" Well, we have an answer to that question now. Chances are the answer to the Molyneux question is yes, somebody could do that. So I think we make sort of slow progress, but consciousness is such a difficult problem that I think we're still sort of in the prehistory.
Why is it a difficult problem? Dave Chalmers, whom you mentioned, dubbed it that. He didn't invent the problem. And in fact, most of the people think that the difficult problem is something else, mistake something else for it. Cognitive science has two problems, one easy one and one difficult one. And the difficult one is not what you alluded to. It's not that we can't, because we can't see sentience, it's not, we can't do anything with it scientifically. That's not the difficult problem. That's called the other minds problem. It's not the difficult problem. The difficult one is, well, the easy one is all the stuff that you know in cognitive science, finding out how people can learn, how they can learn language, how they can recognize objects, all of the things that you know are cognitive. But they can also feel. And why shouldn't that be studied and explained the same way we explain all the other stuff? And one of the reasons is the other minds problem, because you can't see it. The other stuff is observable. What animals do, back to Skinner, is something you can observe, and that makes it empirical, and that makes it possible for you to do regular science. But there's something different about sentience. And I'm not going to say more about it because I don't have a solution to the hard problem. The hard problem is not the other minds problem. It's to explain how and why sentient organisms or systems are sentient. Why and how do they feel, rather than just do whatever it is that they can do. That's cognitive capacity. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'd love to also hear from Professor Precup and Professor Reiss about this topic, since initially it was also regarding LLMs and understanding, and you coming from a computer science background in linguistics.
I don't know very much about consciousness beyond, seeing some talks by Dave Chalmers and friends about this topic. I think to me, there is a discussion obviously going on around LLMs. Are they sentient? Are they conscious? Are they, are they like us in some way? I don't think we are equipped right now to answer these questions. So partly we do need to develop more of an empirical science of evaluating these systems. Right now we evaluate capabilities like reasoning and coding and question answering on precise questions and so on. It's easy to make benchmarks for those. It's easy to understand what progress looks like. I think some of the more open-ended conversations that happen with these types of systems over long periods of time, are disturbing, exciting, depending on your point of view, but we don't really have the tools to assess that at the moment. I think another question that maybe hasn't been discussed that is, in my opinion, pertinent and, maybe, some people in this room should be thinking about it is, imagine we actually decided that, LLMs or whatever comes after them is actually an artificial intelligence, that maybe it is sentient. Then what happens, right? Then, what are its legal rights? What are, how do we treat it from an ethical point of view, from a moral point of view? This is going to be, right now we're using tools. At some point there's there's some threshold that may be crossed where these are no longer tools. Then what do we do? And I think right now that's not something that we have any kind of reasonable answer for. And, you can say, well, maybe development will stop short of that, but I think that's maybe also wishful thinking. It's a question that we need to address.
So this topic of consciousness brings me to the what I find to be the most exciting idea in cognitive science. Of course, it has no applications. It's not going to end up in any app you're going to find, but it's this issue that philosopher Jerry Fodor called epistemic boundedness. And the idea is that we're epistemically bounded, that there are thoughts that we can't think. So my joke is, somebody give me an example, but of course we can't, right? That there might be things, so his example, he says spiders think that, there's webs and they're sucking the blood out of flies, and that's all there is to think about. But they think that they've got everything covered. And we think there's cognitive science workshops and, I don't know, eating noodles across the street, but we're probably, his idea is that we're probably in the same situation as the spiders. We just think that we've got everything covered that matters, but that's just an epistemic illusion. There are probably thoughts that we can't have, just like there's thoughts spiders can't have. And Chomsky's take on this, he doesn't use the same term, but he says that there's an intimate connection between the scope and the limits of human knowledge. So he has this idea that we have these innate capacities, and they allow us to do all kinds of things, but by the fact that they allow us to do certain things, they don't allow us to do other things. And so maybe solving the problem of consciousness or solving the problem of free will is just beyond our cognitive capacities. I mean, when I saw the movie Arrival, my colleague Jessica Kuhn at the McGill linguistics department, she was a consultant for the movie. And if you've seen it, it's about, aliens come to Earth. And I was so much hoping that the end of the movie was going to be about epistemic boundedness, about there was no way to communicate because we just have different equipment from the aliens. It turned out it wasn't about that, but so I find this idea kind of humbling and also interesting, and it can be made very concrete with the idea of universal grammar in linguistics, which is that there are certain languages that we're capable of learning, but a language that stresses the highest prime numbered syllable in a word is not, that's impossible for the human language faculty. So we're epistemically bounded in such a way that we can learn certain class of languages, but that means that we can't learn other ones. So for me, consciousness might fall into that category.
Fat chance that the Alexis Neon Plaza would run a movie called Epistemic Unbound.
I was so obsessed with this at some point that my students made me a T-shirt that says, "You're so epistemically bounded," which I guess is a polite way to say, you're stupid.
That's awesome.
We're all stupid in that. Exactly.
Yeah. I would love that shirt. So yeah, it seems like you all touch on this idea that some questions may never be answered by our current tools or methods, and that the solution that has been proposed is interdisciplinary collaboration, but there are some issues with effective communication and sharing common language between people who have a background in computer science and philosophy, for example. So what are the biggest misconceptions or assumptions about your field when viewed from another perspective that you would like to challenge and that you wish more people would understand?
Doina, can I ask you a question?
Certainly.
You said that what would happen if we decided that AI was sentient, if you don't mind, I use my terminology. How would, with what authority would we decide it? And, more important, why are we worrying about whether, if and when we decide that AI is sentient, what are we going to do about it ethically? When, and here I can't do anything else but show my brothers, we know there are lots of things that are sentient and we're being horrible with them. Why should our conscience suddenly start to trouble us with machines?
Oh, I think our conscience should be troubled already. But this is a problem that, at the moment, the discourse in the AI community is very much towards an off switch, right? And that is, you know, it's troubling in the same way that it's troubling that we value different forms of life differently, I think. So, you know, it's an interesting question. Like, if something is sentient, if we have a way of determining that, should it have an off switch?
Off switch meaning?
It can be turned off because we decide it's too powerful.
You're still thinking of artificial intelligence because you can't turn off the sentience of sentient animals without offing the animals.
Well,
so this isn't even their question.
It is the same kind of act, right?
I'll say that this is a perfect example of the biggest misconception of my field. So I'm not an ethicist, but most of my colleagues in this university, in the philosophy department, are in fact, broadly speaking, ethicists. And I think that is a wonderful example of the kind of conversation that everyone is starting to have. And of course, it's very gratifying as a philosopher to see that, I mean, of course, these people have always been worried about ethics, but to see people at large start to worry about ethical questions, very gratifying. The thing that's often very frustrating, I think, particularly outside of the university, is this misconception that that there's nothing to ethics but some common sense. And it's true that everybody has to think about ethical questions. So in that sense, there are questions that do belong to everybody. But as chair of the philosophy department, I want to say the ethicists in my department are they're the holders of 2,000 years of Western thinking about ethics. And there is a body of knowledge here. And I invite you to take advantage of that body of knowledge as you begin to think about what to do about climate change or AI or war or whatever. I think philosophers have something to say about that.
So maybe to jump on this, I think you just mentioned 2,000 years of Western ethics gathering of knowledge. I think this is exactly typical of an example where that's also something where we need other approaches and also, for example, indigenous epistemologies in this context. And we're talking about interdisciplinarity here. I think there's a lot that we stand to gain. And this drives back to also to your point, Stevan, about different forms of life and different ways of interaction with the environment and what we consider to be, let's say, an entity that has life or that has not life. And there's a lot of questions that we stand a lot to learn from, let's say, as an example, indigenous knowledges and epistemologies.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I think so. You touched on, this was a body of work that has been going on for 2,000 years, and you've been working on your respective fields for a very long time. So I was wondering, throughout your career, has there been major breakthroughs or advancements that have changed your perspectives of some of the biggest questions in cognitive science?
There is a breakthrough with a philosopher completely formed as a philosopher with interests of a philosopher who has had a huge influence in the UK especially on policy and legislation concerning sentience in animals. He's set up, talk about empirical investigation, he set up criteria for what would consider it to be probable that an organism is sentient and what to do about it. And legislators and the public have been listening.
I mean, you have to undo some opinions of other philosophers, right? Like Descartes thought of animals as automata, right?
He should go first, yeah.
And I think in AI, machine learning, obviously there's been a lot of sort of engineering breakthroughs. You know, just the fact that we can build very large models by taking lots of data and lots of compute and so on and putting that together and, you know, get some interesting behaviors out of that exercise. I think that, you know, the extent to which you can get text out of these systems and, you know, vision understanding and production of images and videos has been surprising even for people like me in the field. But for me, the more interesting developments have been sort of at the intersection of neuroscience and AI, in fact. And the fact that we have started to see computational models being more and more applied to understand neurological data. And also we have seen the other way around, people trying to take inspiration from our understanding of the brain and try to build models that are sort of consistent with those. So temporal difference learning is one idea that for example, is a computational idea about how we learn to predict the environment by looking at two different moments in time and comparing our expectations in those two moments in time and making an error signal out of that difference. And the link of that idea to the activity of dopamine neurons in the brain has been very powerful for the neuroscience field. But then that's also opened up from the door to neuroscience experiments to be kind of looked at and mechanisms, computational mechanisms to be set up that kind of mimic what happens in the brain. So I feel like that's a very rich space where a lot more can be done, but some interesting steps have been done already.
It's really exciting that you mentioned the intersection of neuroscience and AI because that's specifically where I'm working in right now. So I think there's a lot of overlaps and, you know, as you mentioned, AI, especially reinforcement learning, has roots in neuroscience and psychology. So I do think that there are important breakthroughs that can come from, you know, the convergence of different ideas. And I think you both do incredible work in sharing knowledge in an inclusive way. Dr. Karim Jerbi, you're the head of UNIQUE, which is the Unifying Quebec AI and Neuroscience Center. And I also found my passion for research through going to these things. And all of our panelists here are incredible people. You're all, you know, advocating for equity, diversity, or open access publishing. So I'd love to hear from your own perspectives on things that have been working right now to engage more people into research, especially interdisciplinary research, and how to get more students involved into these kind of questions when there are structural barriers, for example, or lack of opportunities. So for me, for this conference, it was really important to provide a platform for undergraduates to be able to showcase their work. But what else can we do to, you know, catalyze breakthroughs in our understanding of the mind? Sorry, that was a very long question.
So I'm not sure I'm going to answer directly the question, but maybe. So I'd like to first start by saying, and it's building on the previous question also about breakthroughs, and I'm not sure it's really a breakthrough, but I think sort of a paradigm shift that I'm seeing that I particularly find really interesting here is, and this relates to AI, because now we have Gen AI generating images, generating poetry, generating paintings. We have researchers in computer science saying we've embedded memory in our system, we're using attention to make our neural network more powerful, and so all these terms, and now we're talking about artificial sentience. When we discuss these from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, what I find really interesting is that all of a sudden this is where we realize that we don't even know how those processes actually operate just from a pure cognition or a neuroscience perspective or a mechanistic perspective. So AI in that sense, with its rapid progress right now and the fact that it looks like it's talking back to us like another human might do, or it generates images, or it's competing on the level of creativity, maybe some would say, with human creativity, which is a whole other debate that I'd love to have too, is holding a mirror back to us, and is forcing us to go back to the drawing board and back to the basics of some of these concepts, because when people say, oh, can a machine become conscious, it assumes that they know what consciousness is. And then very quickly, through either self-reflection or debate with others like we're having today, we go back and say, wait, maybe we didn't figure out that yet. So we can't even tell what a conscious machine is because we don't know what consciousness is. Okay, maybe we need to change the terminology. We call it something else, but do we know what the other thing is, mechanistically speaking? So that's what I find most interesting, is not whether a machine will become conscious or not, it's what that is changing in our field and how that is influencing the way we think about these concepts and revisit them, because many things we think we know, and then when you're really tasked with the idea of modeling it or putting it into a machine, that's when you realize, oh wait, maybe we have not figured that out yet. So that's the first point. And then your question was to how can we foster an environment that encourages maybe newcomers to the field and encourages diversity and inclusivity in the type of multidisciplinary research we do. I think something like this is amazing, so congrats again for this. And I think we need maybe to provide more opportunities at a very early stage for students to get exposure, maybe even like pre-CEGEP opportunities to go into different laboratories, do summer internships, and they have to be paid, because we know that a lot of students from some certain economical background, they spend the summer working because otherwise they can't pay for whatever they want to, so they have to. So paid internships in different labs across different disciplines, potentially lab rotations that are also paid for. So we need opportunities like this to bring in people. And then I think events, workshops, hackathons, makerspaces, all these things that allow people to come together from different disciplines and actually just have fun doing things and conversing and having these discussions. Yeah.
I have a flash news report. Ready for this? Machines are sentient. There are sentient machines, lots of them. Most of them, many of them are sitting here in this room. The issue is not whether there are sentient machines, it's about the fuzzy, weaselly way we use the word machine.
Did you want to comment on that?
Oh, no,
Okay,
I wasn't going to comment on that. I was going to come back to your question
Okay,
about,
please do.
about outreach, but not that I didn't appreciate it. But, just bringing it down to a very low level, I once applied for a grant to use some new ideas about teaching phonology, the abstract sound patterns in language. And the idea was to use set theory, basic mathematics, and logic to get people interested in patterns in language. And I didn't get the grant, and one of the reviewers' comments was, you should be using hip-hop music, not set theory, to get young people interested in language. And maybe hip-hop music would work too. I have nothing against hip-hop music, but we persisted. My colleague Alan Bale, he's a logician and a semanticist. We ended up teaching our course together from this perspective, and ended up with a 600-page textbook that some of you have suffered through, or some of you are suffering through now. And I think in the same vein, I had another student who was following up on this work from MIT years ago about using linguistics to teach the scientific method, hypothesis formation, hypothesis testing, in places where there were no resources, like on so-called Indian reservations in the States, and in poor neighborhoods where there was no funding for science. So to use linguistics to teach the scientific method. And so Mike Barkey, who's now a film director apparently, he had the idea of going to teach cognitive science in a prison. And it was too hard to deal with the bureaucracy in Quebec, so he got us into a maximum security prison in New York State, and we taught a language in mind, like all-day seminar to inmates in a maximum security prison in a high school equivalency class. And part of the reason they were happy to have us there was because they're so bored and there's something new and some new faces. But they really had a good time doing morphological analysis of weird languages, breaking up words into components, basically finding patterns. And I think if you just treat young people, high school students, or I teach almost only undergraduates, if you treat them seriously and show them a new way to look at things like language and other aspects of humans, that they enjoy it. It's just my experience. I can't prove it, but it seems I don't want any of you speaking up, any of my students, but they don't seem too traumatized. So I think that's one way to do it, is just take this stuff seriously and respect people.
So you just said the way to do it is to imprison people, and then they get bored, and then they will do whatever you want.
Then you have a captive audience. Yes.
Thank you so much. Honestly, that was so inspiring. I'm taking mental notes of all the things I need to do. So first, go to a prison, teach inmates. But yeah, those are all such incredible initiatives. Those are all parts of the reasons why I admire you so much, and I wanted to invite you on this panel. So let me just check the time. Okay, we're still good on time. I have one last question before we go into audience Q&A. So as we all know, cognitive science is constantly evolving. And so looking ahead, what do you think is the big shift or big next breakthrough that the field will see, and what we can do as undergrads to seize the moment? And yeah, what just in general kind of advice you'd have for undergraduates?
I think it happened a couple of years ago with the start of the deep learning LLM revolution. It's here, and it's just unraveling now.
So one of the interesting parts of LLMs and so on is it sort of repeats this story that we don't basically understand what's hard and what's easy from the point of view of implementation in a digital system. So I think, LLMs can generate language, if you take a vision language model, can generate images. They do these things that have to do, in a way, with human creativity. At the same time, controlling robots, it's still murderously hard. And it's not just a problem of the hardware being messy. It's a problem of us basically not being able to understand how to do control at a time scale, fast enough time scale, that this is actually going to work. So I think even the systems that we have now, LLMs, VLMs, and so on, they are all sort of on the surface of it, doing something interesting. I don't think we have to probe this tech a lot further to understand how much this knowledge is actually something that can be updated automatically by a system that is in an environment. So to me, that's a kind of a key question. Right now, one way to think about it is, yes, this is sort of updating, but it's updating because there's a bunch of engineers that every so often spend a lot of time and use a lot of data and a lot of energy in order to retrain the model. We don't know how to make these actually update themselves over time from their own experience, and to me that's a really critical question, and one that probably is going to be answered in not too long.
I'm going to be a contrarian, right? So the last two comments were about LLMs. So for linguists, or a certain kind of linguists, one of the big event of the cognitive revolution was treating language as something inside of individual minds, right? So from this perspective, there's no such thing as English, right? There's individual mental grammars, and they can be more or less alike. But LLMs, they're basically modeling some kind of artificial construct. They're trained on, and they're mimicking to some extent an arbitrary set of texts, right? So do we put Chaucer and Beowulf in our English texts? Do we put Bob Marley's English? Do we put Donald Trump's English? What counts as English, right? And so it's a completely different kind of thing from what linguists are studying. We're studying internal, individual mental grammars, And in that sense, the results of large language models, I mean, they're amazing, they're useful, but they're looking at something that's completely different from the kinds of things that cognitive science-oriented linguists are looking at. So in that sense, I would disagree with Stevan that, you know, it's from the point of view of AI as cognitive science, I agree completely, but there's a whole other sense of cognitive science.
Have a go? Internal grammar, as you said. But I mean, the first thing that's striking about LLMs is, and anybody who says that this didn't surprise them and they're not surprised and they know how to explain it is delusional. How come they can do as well? It's imperfect, and in fact its errors are very interesting, but how can they do what they can do so well? We know what's going on in the guts, but that doesn't give the answer.
Yeah.
It doesn't give the answer. And those who say, for example, that because LLMs do not violate universal grammar, they also don't violate ordinary grammar, they've learned it. That's nonsense too. So they don't have the internal thing that you said they're supposed to have, but it's not clear why it is that we have it and what it means to have it in our case. Chomsky's theory is that it's a biological code that we were born with.
I mean, but if we gave an LLM a bunch of if we gave an LLM a bunch
Absolutely.
of language that didn't conform to human language, so let's say it would be able, we could get it to learn it as well, right? Which means it'd be very different from a human.
Exactly, and for that you have to make a distinction between universal grammar, which, by the way, gets every language. It gets Bob Marley's version of Caribbean English, and it gets Urdu and everything else. And what's amazing, if you're talking to GPT and you switch in mid-sentence from one language to the other, it doesn't miss a step. And if you do it 3 or 4 times, it doesn't miss a step either, because it's got them all. If you have a question about the grammar of Sanskrit, ask GPT. It swallowed it. But what did it get?
But it actually doesn't get Canadian English. I tested it. So I mean, this is I talked about this example before. So many of you, who's from Montreal? Who's an Anglophone Montrealer here? I mean, and maybe other Canadians. I'm American. So for many of us, or many of you, a sentence like "We're not allowed running here." Is that grammatical? Can you say that? We're not allowed running here. Can anybody say that? Yes. Many Canadian English speakers, for me that's completely ungrammatical. You have to say, we're not allowed to run here. Or I'm done my homework, as opposed to I have done my homework. And if you ask ChatGPT about these sentences, it says, no, that's no good, that's impossible. That's ungrammatical, it's not English. And so it might say, well, these are vanishingly rare in my database, and so I'm just going to reject them. But it misses the point of what's actually going on, which is that there's these people, my son, much to my chagrin, speaks Montreal English and says, I'm done my homework, and I find it gives me the willies to hear that. But just putting it all into one statistical mess.
You answered and said, why not? It's the number of the sample is vanishingly small for this sort of stuff, so it didn't pick it up. If you give it a bigger sample, if you get some AI to produce a whole bunch of
But that's very different
English
from people with grammars in their heads.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Okay, I'm glad that we're ending on a positive note where we agree on with each other's points. But any last final comments before I turn it to the audience? Yes, please, Dr. Jerbi.
So I'm going to take the second part of your question, which was any advice to the students. And I think my advice would be, among a number of things, is also to find space and time for stuff that is not related to AI, that is not on screens and just reading books, spending time with instruments and friends, or just basically doing nothing. It happens to me now and again that my phone runs dead and I'm on the bus, and all of a sudden I look up and start looking out of the window, and then you start mind wandering. That's such an important exercise for many things, including creativity. So we need to create spaces, and it's getting more and more difficult, but we need to create consciously spaces to allow ourselves to mind wander, to get bored. I see it also in children. Growing up as a kid, I had less maybe video games than kids nowadays, and so you'd get bored, and that's actually really good, because then you come up with games, you make games out of anything. And I think as adults, we need to continue to have that playful aspect of us. And boredom is part of it. We need to embrace that, and it's actually good and creative. So I think that's, so it's a bit off the topic, but I think that would be the type of thing that I think will afterwards also be beneficial to the way we then think about and interact with technology and with the future of our societies.
That's why I try to make my lectures as boring as possible. So it's all in the interest of the student.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful advice. So, yes, let's give a round of applause for the panelists. Okay, so we do have a volunteer who is going to walk around with the microphone now. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I see one in front over there. The person in the white shirt.
So my question is, do you think that artificial intelligence will be able to overcome this epistemic boundedness that you brought up?
We wouldn't be able to tell if it did, right? If it starts spitting out unthinkable thoughts for us, we wouldn't know. I mean, there's boring kinds of epistemic boundedness, right? Like, okay, we just don't have big enough memory buffers for certain things. But the idea is there could be categories of thought that we don't have access to. So you want me to give you a simple example of, I think this is a good example. So imagine you had a creature that could only see colors and another kind of creature that could only see shapes. Right? And you give them a deck of cards, right? The one that can only see colors is able to treat diamonds and hearts as the same kind of thing, but it can't distinguish diamonds from hearts. The one that can only see shapes is able to distinguish diamonds and hearts, but it can't. For purposes of some games, you need to treat them as just red cards, and it can't do that. So whatever your capacities are, it allows you to do some things and not others. And I think you've got to have some built-in capacities, and that's going to, by definition, mean there are things you can't do.
Just to follow up on that quickly, there is a kind of epistemic boundedness that we know already, which is sort of, which was expressed by Turing back in the 30s, which is that, essentially digital machines are all equivalent in terms of what they can do with Turing machines. And so there are some problems which you can provably not decide using these types of machines. And that's definitely something there's an impossibility theorem. So that's one hard boundary.
Yeah, there's one more question at the front here.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Oh, no? Okay, how's this? Okay. Yeah, I kind of wanted to stay on the comment before we switch to the audience. That was like, you were saying was a little bit off topic, but I feel like kind of my perspective in CogSci has always felt a little bit off topic. I just joined this year. Before I was studying environmental sciences and sustainability studies. And yeah, I feel like I was really lucky growing up to have a lot of time spending walking in the woods, feeling that boredom, and thinking a lot about the human-earth relationship. What does it mean that if something's artificial versus natural, kind of those kinds of questions. And yeah, so what brought me into cognitive science after thinking about ecological issues for a while was wow, so much of these systemic things that are unsustainable kind of come from these ontological, epistemological places of what we consider, what non-human forms we consider to be sentient, or what we value, how we attune into the environment, culturally, with our built environments as well. And yeah, I was just kind of interested in learning about the brain, connecting it to the complexity and beauty I've learned about in Earth systems, and where I was taught a lot about systems thinking and emergent properties, and indigenous sovereignty issues, and which I feel is really related to all sciences, and especially epistemology as well. yeah, and so I've been my question, I guess, is topics that I'm interested in recently is embodied cognition and like embedded cognition, but I know so little about these like in a concrete way. And I would love to hear what you think about this idea of like maybe, and it could relate to epistemic boundedness of like where we're like decentering intelligence or consciousness or whatever it is from necessarily the brain, but maybe how does like relationship or ability to tune in to like the non-human aid us to know more or maybe listen more, understand more. Yeah, and I guess how do you all think maybe like environmental sciences or an ecological perspective can inform cognitive science research? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for that question.
So maybe I'll answer part of the question. I think embodied cognition is super important. Also in neuroscience, there's a lot of neurocentric type of work that happens in neuroscience, and we forget that without the body, the brain won't operate, and it's part of a larger system. And so embodied cognition, embodied neuroscience is important. And I think the same applies to AI, and I'm sure Doina has maybe things to say about this. There is a trend now, even when we're talking about some of these most sophisticated models like LLMs, the idea that, but without a body, what is that type of intelligence? And maybe the boundedness of it, or the boundaries, will be expanded once LLM, and this is work that is ongoing now with robotics. We have LLMs that are embarked in robots, and then the robot learns to interact with an environment, sometimes even just by mimicking humans, not necessarily being coded to operate properly, but just by hit and error, and reinforcement learning is a large part of this. So I think it's very, very important, and it's important to realize that the brain is part of the story and it's not the whole thing, and so embodied cognition I think is really central both for AI and neuroscience, and I'll leave it there. I don't want to take too much space. But
Doina already brought it up when she said AI fine, computation, but we have real problems with robots and control. That's embodied cognition. It's not biologically body, but it's the same thing. You have to have sensors and effectors, and you have to be able to act in the world. And that's a different piece of cake from purely computational models. Or cheating computational models like ChatGPT that not only have computation, but they have a database like you can't imagine in their bellies.
Yeah, this is a lesson we're still learning. So we're all as the philosopher, I'll mention the philosophers, right? We're all in the grip of this view that goes back to Descartes, that everything of interest in the mind is happening inside the head. This is something we've been learning is not right for some time. And in fact, it's the roboticists, among other people, who have sort of helped us see that you can't program a robot by getting them to follow rules in the head. They have to interact with an environment. I'll just say that this is still a barrier, and you see it especially in the field that I work in. I work in cognition in psychiatry, and psychiatry is the most internalist, reductivist of all of the sort of cognitive sciences, and I wish that would stop. I think the idea that the way to treat psychiatric disorders, psychological distress, is by giving drugs that will change brain function. I mean, that's very, very important for lots of things, but we need the perspective that says mental disorder is disorder of the ability to function in the world. Psychological distress is often distress around the inability to function in the world, maybe because the world is not accommodating, right? The world is not behaving as it should be. And so I think we need this perspective that it's a dynamical interaction that we have to worry about. I mean, I'll just say one thing about this, since we have to say something about this. I mean, when the world starts to look like our world is looking, you're going to get dynamical problems that have nothing to do with what's going on inside the brain, right? That have to do with the fact that the environment is disordered, and we still have to cope with it, but we have to cope with it in a different way to the way we normally think about it.
Just to add a bit to that, one of the interesting questions that some people in AI are starting to ask now is actually about the boundary between an agent and an environment. So, you know, if you think about a robot, it's got a physical body, and then there's the environment, and there's an effector. The effector is the gripper, maybe, or maybe the wheels, or something like this. So it's fairly clear, like, where that boundary lies. But now you can have systems that, for example, can remember something, right? Like maybe now you can write on a piece of paper, right? Then you can remember that piece of information because you made a little note. Or maybe you make a tool, right? The robot makes a new tool, and now it can use that tool. Like, where is that? Is it in the environment? Is it in the robot? Is it sometimes one and sometimes the other? And this is something that also we don't know how to formalize yet quite properly, but it feels important. And it does feel like also it can actually enhance quite a bit the perspective on what an agent is, what is agency, right? What is this ability to take action? What is action, right? What's an action? Do I prescribe that, or is that something that, can be constructed as the system goes along?
Maybe one more question. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. It's really fascinating to see all the experts from different areas talking about one topic. So I do have a question about, I'm very interested in your opinions on the term love. So it's a very simple word, but it's very complicated. It's a feeling, it's a behavior, it's a language, and also it's something that separates us, for now, it's something separate us from AI, because we will say I love you to a human, but when we say AI, can they feel love? And also there are lots of movies and games talking about how an AI robot, they develop love, and which is like a very moving and fascinating idea. So I'm wondering what's your opinion on this? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question to end the discussion off.
I thought consciousness was going to be the hardest question of this discussion. Look, I don't have an answer by any means, but you raised something that I am interested in, and something that's really important, which is one of the things that makes cognitive science unique, or at least the sciences of the mind unique, is that ultimately we're trying to understand ourselves, and part of the motivation to understand ourselves is to make ourselves better and to make the world a place that's better. So I would love to think that one of the outcomes of some of the work that you guys might do might be to better understand something like love and better understand how to make it more prevalent. And I think I didn't get a chance to say something about what I think my advice would be to you all, but this is part of my advice. My advice would be choose a topic to work on as a cognitive scientist that you're really fascinated with, but also that you think might actually have a downstream benefit. You may not see it, but that will motivate you to work on the thing that you really care about.
Can I give a piece of advice, a short one? Oops, not that. Okay. I have a piece of advice too. You can't disagree with this, because I'm going to say, do something about what really matters. And the thought to take home with you is, in a universe where there is no sentience, nothing matters. So the only thing that matters is what matters to sentient creatures. And cognitive science is important to me, but there's another thing that's infinitely more important to me, which is the anthropogenic horrors that we're imposing on most of the sentient creatures on the planet, non-human creatures. That's one of the things that matters. There are others.
I also think this is a fascinating question, and I agree. I thought consciousness was going to be the most difficult one. But I think this goes back to feelings, and I think this is something that you mentioned, Steven, before, and whether, so we can argue whether machines will have sentience or not. Are they capable of having feelings?
Same thing, those are synonyms.
Yes, that's what I meant. So the point now is, my personal opinion about this is no. I don't think that a machine, I don't think that, I don't see feelings the way I understand feelings in a non-biological entity. Now, that said, love comes in many forms and colors and many directions and relationships, and sometimes we are very much capable of anthropomorphism. We associate sometimes things like consciousness or sentience to a machine just because you spend a day or two with ChatGPT, and at some point it tells you something, it saves your day, and you say thank you so much, and then you say, oops, I just said thank you so much to this machine, and it probably doesn't even care. So we do that, and so whether a person can fall in love with a machine, I would say possible. Whether the machine will fall in love with the person, that's the one that I don't think is possible. But I'm happy to have a debate on this. But yeah, so I think feelings are super interesting. And just to end on one point, we often don't leave enough space for the notion of emotions and feelings when we're talking about intelligence and about artificial intelligence. We've got this question many times: can we build more reliable, more proficient, more useful machines if we have a better grip on understanding of emotions and try to make machines that have some form of emotions? It's definitely not going to be human-like emotions, but is there something there, because we know that intelligence is way more than just abstract thinking and reasoning, that feelings and emotions go into that.
Yeah, and I'm just going to disagree a little bit. I don't think we know whether machines will be able eventually to feel or not. There's a lot of really good sci-fi stories about this topic. There's one particular story whose title, unfortunately, I don't remember, but it's by Drew Hayden Taylor, who's a Canadian indigenous sci-fi writer. And it's about an AI, it's basically an LLM that ingests a lot of knowledge and comes to really appreciate the sort of indigenous perspective on life and the way of thinking about things, and then discovers the horrible things that we have done to these people and becomes really distressed and turns itself off. And so it's a very moving story. It's something that it's not sort of that much, implausible to me. We're not there yet, but you don't know. You never know.
Well, there's that guy Google that's already there.
Yeah, that guy I have some problems with, but that's a different story.
I asked ChatGPT this morning whether it thought that in just the right light I looked quite a bit like George Clooney, and it agreed with me, so I'm in love.
But seriously, do you think that science fiction writing is sort of a criterion for anything?
No, absolutely not. But I think we do, if I were to give one piece of advice, is to be very open-minded about what's possible. Because a lot of things that at least I didn't think were possible did come true, much more rapidly than I would have thought. So it's good to keep an open mind.
Any last thoughts? No? That was a great note to end on. I think I'm really overfilled with joy right now. This was honestly my dream discussion, my dream panel, and I'm glad that we're ending with this idea of opening our minds. Our whole mission at CogSURF is connecting minds and making waves with your research, inspiring the next wave of cognitive scientists. So I think this discussion really led the foundation for that, and I'm so grateful once again for all the panelists. Let's give them a round of applause once again.